Hey guys, how are you? It's Arthi, and in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about my immigrant story and experiences of being here in America. Now, I've been here in the US for quite some time, so I'm not a new immigrant, but I still thought that it would be interesting just to give you some highlights of the experiences that I've had here, because I know people are always moving to the Western world. And I think in modern times today, things are probably a little bit different. I think what an immigrant deals with in 2018 is very different from what I dealt with back in the 80s and through the 90s. And it's just good to get different perspectives sometimes. And hopefully you might come across this video if you're coming to the US sometime soon, or maybe Canada or even the UK. And, might be a little bit helpful for you, I hope. All right, so let me just get started. I'll give you a quick rundown about my parents. I won't spend too much time on that, and then I'll just move on through the rest of my life. Well, my parents are from India, and I was born there. They're from two different parts. My dad is from the north, and my mom's from the south. And we didn't live in India for too long. From there, we went to Dublin, Ireland, and my father was getting his PhD. So we lived in Dublin until I was between 6.5 to 7 years old. And then from there, we moved again to the US, and we settled in a neighborhood right outside of Boston. And I remember the neighborhood was not exactly suburban. It was more on the urban side because there was tons of street parking and it was very crowded, had a big mixture of people. And I started school there. Well, I had gone to school in Ireland already, but then I continued my education because my parents enrolled us in a school which wasn't too far. My sister and I walked every single day, which I know seems kind of shocking by today's standards because we were pretty young. She was 5 and I had just turned 7, and I would walk with her hand in hand. It's crazy, right? I don't think any parent would allow their child to do that today. I know I wouldn't, but we walked every day. And then we lived in that town not for too long. We just waited for my dad to finish his PhD and everything else and some other stuff he was doing. Then once he was done with that, we moved 2 hours away from Boston, and we wound up in a very nice suburb, a small town. It was very kind of like a hippie town, very liberal. It was a university town also, and my father got a job there, and that is where my immigrant story really begins. Now, the first challenge that I always had when I first came to the US is that a lot of times people would think that I didn't know how to speak English because my parents were Indian, and I don't know why sometimes people just make this assumption that Indian people don't know English. I mean, I know not every Indian person does, but for the most part, it is a fairly English-speaking country because there's so many different languages and dialects in India that we kind of all have to speak English to communicate with each other. And when I started school, a lot of teachers that I had would ask me, can you speak English and can you read this book if I would be given an assignment or something. And I would always have to tell them, yes, I know how to speak English because I had lived in Ireland previously and my parents spoke English at home anyway, so it wasn't really a big deal. And that was, something that was new, and I kind of thought it was strange that they kept asking me that question, but I guess that was kind of the way immigrants were looked upon back then. People had this idea that if you're an immigrant, you probably don't know English. I don't know why, but that's kind of the way it was, I guess. And then the second thing was my name. So if you look at the banner on my YouTube channel, you'll see my name, Arthi, has 2 A's at the beginning. And that was something that always made me crazy when I was a kid because I dreaded the first day of school, because when the teacher would take attendance and he or she would go down the list of names, they would call out everyone's name, and everyone had, in my mind, a normal sounding name. Then they would get to mine and they'd be like, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but is an Arati or Arate here? They never knew how to pronounce it, and then I would have to kind of raise my hand, and I would always feel embarrassed. I would have to correct them and say it's actually Arthi, and then they would look at my name and be confused, like, what do you mean Arthi? It has 2 A's and there's a T, there's no H. And then have to give them the whole story that tell them it's Indian, and yeah, that's just how it's pronounced, that the spelling is different from the pronunciation. That was never fun. That was just constant over and over again through my childhood, in school, even in social situations, or if I was speaking to someone on the phone, they had to spell my name. It was the whole, this is how you spell it, this is why, and giving the whole rundown. That was just never pleasant. I just hated that aspect of it. Then the second thing was just in general having to deal with stereotypes back in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if it's so common these days, but back then, people would kind of stereotype you when they knew that you were an immigrant, because during that time there was a big influx of immigration coming into this country. Well, I think it kind of started back in the 70s, but it went on even, way beyond that. And people would just always, ask, of course, do you know English? Aside from being in school, just outside in social situations. And then they would ask questions like, where were you born? And do you speak English at home? Do your parents know English? Where do your parents work? And all that stuff, just the whole set of questions that an immigrant person or child would have to answer back in those days, because of the stereotyping was just really frustrating. And I just hated having to deal with that, because I never felt like I should have to give anyone a history about who I was and where I came from. But it just seemed like people felt like they had the right to just question you and just know about you and your background and who you are, where you come from and all that. And I just started to dislike that as the years went on. It just got really annoying. And there was a point in time in my life where I would just tell people that I was just born in Ireland. And it was funny because when I would do that, they never questioned anything beyond that. They just would say, oh, that's really cool. And how long did you live there? And I'm sure Ireland is a beautiful country. It rains a lot, and, all that stuff that they think, which in the grand scheme of things, that worked out to be much better than saying I'm from India, and then listening to comments from people about what a third world country it is, and do cows wander the streets? And yes, they do, but why should I have to explain that over and over again? I mean, it is how it is. So because I'm a person, not just a little immigrant, is what I thought at the time. Now, the third thing, I think I'm on the third thing, right? The third thing is having to deal with cultural differences, because since my sister and I came here to the U.S. when we were very young, it was difficult because just through the natural process of things, we became more Americanized, and my parents wanted us to be more Indian. They wanted to maintain the culture and what they knew at home, and they wanted us to kind of carry that with us into the outside world. And that would cause a lot of friction between my parents and my sister and I. It's just, it's difficult because you have to kind of let go of certain things when you come from a different culture, because your children will, of course, integrate wherever they are, and they're going to consider themselves to be whatever, culture they're in, whether it's American, or even if you say you're Canadian, or you're living in England or Australia, wherever it is. If you grow up there, that's what you're going to think you are first. Not that you don't value your parents' culture from back home, but that's just how it is. And that was really challenging in the beginning, but as time went on, my parents, they started to integrate a little more themselves, and then it got to be a little bit easier. That next thing I could tell you about as far as being in America, through the years, it's just, once I finished school and I went to college and I completed that and I went into the workforce, that was kind of, I guess, another challenge in my life a little bit, because, back in the 90s, I think people were still not new, but they had different ideas or attitudes towards immigrants. They were still kind of learning things about the immigrant population. And I remember the first job that I got, I was working as a receptionist. I was answering the phones, and when people would hear my voice and they would start talking to me, they would think that I was just an American woman. And then sometimes I would have to give my name to people, like, say, if clients were calling into the office because it was a real estate company, and they would say, well, who am I speaking with? And I would have to give them not my last name, but just my first name. And as soon as I would give them my first name, they would always be kind of thrown off and a little confused. And I remember one guy said to me one day, he said, "Oh, well, how come you don't have an accent? I thought you're just an American woman. Why is your name so strange?" And I had to explain to him that my parents are from India and I've been in this country for a long time. And then he said, oh, I get it. That's why. Because that's why you don't have that heavy accent that, Indian people have. That's why you sound normal like an American person. I was like, yes, thank you. Even though I felt like slightly offended by that, I was like, okay. But, that's like some of the stuff that I had to deal with, especially with phone conversations with people, having to explain why there's no accent, why do I have a quote funny name, and why do I not sound more Indian even though I'm telling you I'm Indian. I don't know. And I'm going to tell you another quick story of something that had happened to me years ago at the same real estate office where I was working. Now, I was making a phone call one day and a guy called me back. He was one of the clients of somebody in the office, and I never spelled my name out for him. I never told him what my name was, but for some reason he thought that it was Dorothy, because when I say Arthi to people on the phone, I guess it just naturally sounds more like Dorothy. So he I transferred the phone call over to my boss, and after he finished the conversation with my boss came up to the lobby where I was sitting, and he was laughing. He was like, "Oh, the guy you just spoke with, he asked me if you have a speech impediment." And I was like, huh, what? What do you mean? He said, well, because, he told me, he said, what's wrong with that girl at the front desk? She keeps mispronouncing her name. Her name's Dorothy, but she keeps saying Arthi. So is there something wrong? Does she have a speech impediment? You should tell her to go work on that, because she doesn't know how to say her own name. And he was, my boss was just thinking that it was the funniest thing in the world. And I didn't really take offense to it. I just kind of laughed it off also at the time. But then years later, when I look back upon it, I was like, wow, that was kind of rude. Like, why would somebody just say that or just assume that I didn't know my own name? And I just, I don't know. I was kind of blown away by that. So I guess that just gives you like another idea of how maybe sometimes some people, even in, I guess, quote, modern times, are still not exposed to the, like, I guess, immigrant names or ethnic names. I think your experience will be very different from mine, only because of the fact, today we have social media available to us. You have platforms like YouTube, you have Instagram, where people are very active, and you have the opportunity to connect more with people around the world. And I think people in Western nations, they also have the chance to see what it's like, or at least get a small taste of what it's like for people in other countries. So when they do meet someone, say from, on the eastern side of the world, they're not so surprised, or at least they have a little bit of knowledge of what the people will be like once they arrive. And, it's a very different world today. And I think people are just more open-minded, and it's just easier to make your way through. And if you are going to come to the US or anywhere around here, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I have noticed these days that people tend to speak English a lot more, and that probably won't be too much of an issue. And even if you don't speak English, you can learn. You will probably be just fine. And that's it. And I don't know if there's anything else I really have to cover. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. That's also, just let me know what you think. Just tell me about your stories. And so that's it. I'll see you guys next time. And I love you as always. Okay? Bye.